All right, so get this. Today we're going deep on some pretty wild economic theories. Have you ever thought about government spending and income tax? Maybe even dabbled in a little Dogecoin?
Oh, yeah. Definitely relevant these
Well,
days.
get ready, because this deep dive is going to be a wild ride. We're taking inspiration from this valuetainment video that actually claims we could totally ditch income tax.
No kidding.
Seriously.
That's a bold claim.
The host basically lays out this radical plan using tariffs and a major government makeover.
Sounds intense. We'll break it all down for you and see if it holds water.
For sure. So the video kicks off with something that always gets people riled up, presidential pardons.
Oh, well, this should be good.
Right. It specifically focuses on the idea of Biden pardoning folks from the Trump administration, even maybe family members.
That's interesting. The video makes a point about how the media seems to react way differently to Biden potentially pardoning his family compared to when Trump was considering the same thing for his own.
Definitely a double standard they're pointing out there.
Makes you wonder, are pardons really about justice or are they more about politics?
Yeah, good question. And then, to make things even spicier, the video throws out some pretty unexpected pardon candidates: Edward Snowden and anyone involved with Silk Road.
Now, those are some names you don't hear every day.
Right. For those who need a refresher.
Okay, so Edward Snowden, he's that former intelligence guy who leaked a ton of classified info about, government surveillance programs. Totally sparked this massive debate about privacy versus national security. He's been living in exile ever since.
Wild story. And Silk Road, wasn't that like an online black market, kind of a hidden corner of the internet?
Exactly, on the dark web. People were buying and selling all sorts of illegal stuff there. Huge operation until the FBI shut it down.
Wow. So the video is basically saying that pardoning these guys could be seen as promoting transparency and individual freedom.
Right, that's the argument.
Pretty unconventional take. But how does this even connect to ditching income tax? Seems like a big jump to me.
It does, doesn't it? That's where the video switches gears and dives into government spending and how it all gets paid for. And get this, the host throws out this crazy stat. The U.S. government only pulls in something like $80 billion from tariffs.
Wait a second, 80 billion. That still sounds like a ton of money.
It is, but hold on. Compare that to the total government revenue, which is a whopping 4.7 trillion.
Oh, wow.
Suddenly, 80 billion seems kind of small, right? It really shows how much we've moved away from tariffs as our main source of income.
Yeah, you're right. Which actually blows my mind, because didn't the U.S. rely on tariffs for everything 150 years ago? Back then, no income tax, right?
You got it. It's wild how things have changed. So basically, wars, especially the Civil War and World War I, forced the government to find new ways to rake in cash, and fast.
Makes sense. During wartime, things get expensive.
Big time. That's where income tax popped onto the scene, and over time, it became the big kahuna of government funding.
So it sounds like relying on income tax isn't some universal law, more like a system that kind of just happened.
Yeah, exactly. It evolved out of necessity. And get this, there was even this short period back in 1894 when the Supreme Court actually said federal income tax was unconstitutional.
Really? So how we collect our money has been a wild ride, huh?
Totally. Definitely not set in stone.
So the video paints this picture of how we got here, then boom, drops this bombshell about potentially getting rid of income tax altogether. This has got to be where that big idea comes in, right?
You got it. The host proposes this two-pronged approach. Jack up those tariffs and slash spending. Specifically, he suggests raising tariffs across the board to a whopping 25%, which he thinks could rake in $1 trillion in revenue.
Pull up $1 trillion. That's insane, going from 80 billion to $1 trillion.
Yes, sir.
But wouldn't raising tariffs that high cause a whole mess of other issues? What about regular people and businesses?
You bring up a good point. Increasing tariffs could definitely make stuff we import way more expensive, and it could even trigger trade wars with other countries. It's a tricky situation with some serious downsides to think about.
Yeah, sounds like a tightrope walk. So what about the flip side? Cutting spending. Where does the video suggest we make those cuts?
The host points a finger right at the U.S. military budget, the big one, as the prime target. His argument is that we're hemorrhaging money on military stuff overseas, specifically calling out the 52,000 troops we've got stationed in Japan.
So his thinking is countries like Japan, who are majorly in debt to us, should be chipping in more for our military presence over there.
Exactly. He's basically questioning whether all that military spending is really necessary, or if we could get the same level of security without blowing so much cash.
Interesting. And then things get really interesting. The video suggests using, wait for it, Dogecoin to create a Department of Government Efficiency.
Now that's a curveball.
Right, it's like government powered by memes. Is this for real?
It's a little hazy, gotta be honest.
Yeah.
Not crystal clear what a Dogecoin-run government department would even look like.
I mean, Dogecoin started as a joke, right? So is this a serious proposal or are they just messing with us?
Tough to say for sure. But even if we don't take the Dogecoin part literally, the idea behind it, using tech to make the government run smoother, that's worth thinking about.
Yeah, I can see that. So maybe it's not about Dogecoin itself, but about using new tech, maybe something like blockchain, to cut down on all the red tape and make things more efficient.
Possibly, yeah. The video does highlight this stat. Only 6% of government employees actually work full-time from the office. They seem to be suggesting this contributes to the inefficiency.
But couldn't there be other reasons for that, like maybe outdated systems or bureaucratic nonsense or just no clear goals, you know?
Oh, for sure. Blaming it all on remote work is probably a bit simplistic. Got to look at the bigger picture and consider all the options.
Definitely. So we've got tariffs, military spending, and even Dogecoin on the table. What other radical ideas does this valuetainment video have up its sleeve?
Buckle up for this one, because the host proposes a total overhaul of Social Security. He's talking about reimbursing everyone who's currently paying in, and then just scrapping future contributions, basically hitting the reset button on the whole thing.
Whoa, hold on, that's a massive change. What about everyone who's already retired or depends on Social Security? Would they just be out of luck?
The video suggests exempting anyone over 65 who's still working from income tax, letting them keep more of their earnings, but it doesn't really address how this whole new system would be funded, or if it could even last.
So a lot of unanswered questions and potential downsides there.
Definitely. Bold idea, but any big changes to Social Security need to be carefully thought out, making sure everyone, regardless of age or income, is protected.
Agreed. It feels like the video's kind of skipping over some of the potential pitfalls. What about people who've been paying into Social Security for years and years? Would they just get left behind?
That's a major concern for sure. Any major shift in how Social Security works needs a clear plan for the transition and a guarantee that everyone's taken care of.
Absolutely. It's not as simple as just flipping a switch.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've explored these pretty radical ideas about tariffs, government spending, and Social Security. And just when you thought we were done with presidential pardons, the video circles back to challenge the whole Trump as the pardon king narrative.
Oh, this should be good.
Right. And they hit us with this surprising stat. FDR actually pardoned way more people than Trump did. We're talking almost 4,000 pardons for FDR compared to just 237 for Trump.
Wow, that's a huge difference. But does the number of pardons tell the whole story? Is it really that simple?
Good point. The video argues that we can't just look at the numbers. We got to consider the context of each pardon. What were the motivations behind them? Were they actually acts of mercy or something else altogether?
Exactly. Like the video mentions Ford's pardon of Nixon. Super controversial, right? A lot of people saw that as a purely political move to avoid more scandal.
And on the flip side, you have Trump's pardon of Alice Marie Johnson, a woman serving a life sentence for a nonviolent drug offense. That one was widely praised, even by some of Trump's biggest critics.
So you can see how just counting the pardons doesn't give you the full picture. You got to look at the details, the why, the who, and the potential fallout, good or bad.
It's a reminder that things aren't always black and white. And it's up to each of us to decide if we think these pardons were justified or not.
Definitely. There are valid points on both sides of the pardon debate. It's a conversation we need to keep having as a society.
For sure. This whole deep dive has really highlighted how important it is to think critically and consider all sides of an issue. It's easy to get swept up in sensational headlines or partisan talking points, but we got to step back and analyze the information objectively.
Totally agree. Especially in today's world, with so much information coming at us from all directions, it's more crucial than ever to be smart about what we consume and sharpen those critical thinking skills.
Absolutely. So what does all this mean for you, our listener? What should you be taking away from all this talk about government spending, income tax, and everything in between?
The big takeaway, I think, is this. Don't be afraid to challenge the conventional wisdom, question the assumptions, and explore different viewpoints. Whether it's about tariffs, government efficiency, or even the role of cryptocurrency, there are no easy answers or one-size-fits-all solutions.
It's about having thoughtful conversations, weighing the pros and cons, and ultimately figuring out what kind of future we want for our government and our society.
A future that's shaped by our collective choices, our informed decisions, and our willingness to engage in constructive dialogue.
I don't know about you, but this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about.
Hmm.
I'm curious to hear what our listeners think. What ideas stuck with you? What would you research further?
And what are your thoughts on the potential for change? Do you think we could actually see a major shift in government spending and revenue, or are these radical ideas just wishful thinking? It's a good point. Pardons, they always seem to stir things up no matter who's in charge.
Yeah.
But going back to that idea of ditching income tax, it is a pretty radical concept.
Yeah, for sure.
Makes you wonder, could it even work?
That's what I'm wondering. It sounds great in theory, but there's got to be some major downsides, right? Like, could we really fund the entire government just from
That's
tariffs?
a big question.
And what about prices for like everything? Wouldn't they skyrocket?
Yeah, you've got a point there. The video says a 25% tariff on everything could bring in $1 trillion.
Hmm.
But you got to think, what if other countries retaliate?
Right, like a trade war.
Exactly. What if they slap tariffs on our stuff?
Hmm.
Wouldn't that just lead to higher prices for everyone?
Yeah, feels like a slippery slope. And then there's the whole spending cuts thing, especially in the military. I mean, I get it. The U.S. military budget is huge, but is just slashing it really the answer?
It's complicated. The video uses that example of U.S. troops in Japan, saying countries like Japan, they owe us money. They should be paying more for protection.
Hmm.
But there's more to it than that, right?
Yeah, there's got to be.
It's not just about money. There's strategy, geopolitics, all that stuff.
It makes you wonder, would pulling back our troops actually make us less safe in the long run? What about our relationships with our allies?
Exactly. It's not as simple as just saying, hey, pay up.
Hmm.
There are always ripple effects.
Right. Always unintended consequences. And speaking of complicated, let's talk about that Department of Government Efficiency thing, the whole Dogecoin thing. I'm still trying to wrap my head around that one.
I know, right? It sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. The government running on meme coins.
Is that really what they're suggesting? Like, hand over the reins to Dogecoin.
It's hard to tell how serious they are about the Dogecoin part.
Mm,
But I think the bigger point is, how do we make the government run better? And maybe blockchain technology could be part of that.
maybe. But couldn't we look into that without betting on a volatile cryptocurrency? What about focusing on things like making those bureaucratic processes less clunky? Getting better data management systems, setting clear goals for government agencies.
All great points. And honestly, those solutions seem way more practical than trying to build a government department on a, meme coin.
I'm with you on that one. And while we're talking about government programs, what about that radical Social Security proposal? Reimbursing everyone and then just scrapping future contributions? That's a huge risk, isn't it?
It is. The video says exempting folks over 65 who are still working from income tax could help pay for it. But what happens when those people retire? And what about people with disabilities who rely on Social Security? So many questions they don't answer.
It feels like they're just brushing over the potential problems.
Well,
What about people who've been paying into Social Security their whole lives? Would they just be left hanging?
that's a big concern, for sure. Any big changes to Social Security need to be super carefully planned out with a clear way to move to a new system and a guarantee that everyone's protected.
It feels like the video raises more questions than it answers.
Yeah, that happens a lot with these kinds of arguments. They're great for starting a debate, getting people to think differently, but you got to dig deeper, really think through the consequences.
That's exactly what we're doing here. We're not just taking these claims at face value, we're looking at different perspectives, considering the downsides, encouraging you to really think critically about all this.
Exactly. It's about having an informed and nuanced conversation. Whether you agree with this valuetainment video or not, it's important to understand the issues and have a thoughtful debate.
And speaking of debate, those presidential pardons always seem to get people fired up.
They do. And that comparison between Trump and FDR, I think that's a really interesting one. On the surface, it looks like FDR was way more lenient with pardons, thousands versus hundreds.
Yeah.
But is that a fair comparison?
That's the question. The video says we got to look beyond the numbers and think about the context of each pardon. What was the motivation? Was it truly an act of mercy or something else entirely?
Exactly. Like they mentioned Ford pardoning Nixon. That was a super controversial move. A lot of people thought it was just a way to sweep the scandal under the rug.
Right. Purely political. And then you have Trump pardoning Alice Marie Johnson, who was serving a life sentence for a nonviolent drug offense. That one was pretty widely praised, even by some of Trump's critics.
So you can see how just looking at how many pardons there were doesn't tell you the whole story. You got to look at the specifics, the circumstances, the potential consequences, both good and bad.
Right, like what message does it send? What kind of precedent does it set?
Exactly. And ultimately, it's up to each of us to decide. Do we think these pardons were justified? Was it the right thing to do?
There's no easy answer, for sure.
Definitely valid arguments on both sides. It's a conversation we need to keep having as a society.
Yeah, definitely. This whole deep dive has really shown how important it is to think for ourselves, to question things, to consider different perspectives. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines or what your own side is saying, but it's so important to take a step back and look at things objectively.
Couldn't agree more.
Hmm.
Especially these days with information overload everywhere you look, it's more crucial than ever to be a critical thinker, to really be discerning about what you consume.
So what does all this mean for our listeners? What should they be taking away from this exploration of government spending, income tax, all of it?
I think the key takeaway is this. Don't be afraid to question things, to challenge the status quo, to look at different viewpoints. Whether it's about tariffs, government efficiency, even cryptocurrency, there's no easy answer, no one-size-fits-all solution.
It's all about having thoughtful discussions, considering all sides, and ultimately deciding what kind of future we want for our government, for our society.
A future that's shaped by our choices, by informed decisions, by our willingness to have these conversations, even when they're tough.
I don't know about you, but this deep dive has given me a lot to think about, and I'm really curious to hear what our listeners think. What resonated with you? What would you research further?
Yeah, what piqued your interest? And what are your thoughts on the possibility of change? Do you think we could actually see a major shift in how the government spends and collects money? Or are these radical ideas just, pie in the sky?
Man, we covered some serious ground today, from presidential pardons and Edward Snowden to Dogecoin and like totally revamping Social Security. That valuetainment video, it really threw out some wild economic ideas.
It did. And even if you don't buy into everything they said, it definitely makes you think about how the government works and where our tax money goes.
You know, what really hit me was the historical stuff, like learning that the US used to run entirely on tariffs and that income tax was actually ruled unconstitutional at one point. It really puts things in perspective, you know? Like the system we have now, it's not some unchangeable law. It evolved over time.
Right, exactly. And that's what makes this whole discussion so interesting. The way we collect money and fund the government, it's changed so much throughout history.
It has, usually because of some major event like a war or an economic crisis.
Exactly. So maybe these radical ideas like ditching income tax altogether or using Dogecoin to streamline the government, maybe they're not as crazy as they sound at first.
Yeah, maybe not. And even if we don't end up making those huge changes, these conversations can spark new ideas, lead to smaller improvements that make the government more efficient.
Absolutely. Like that proposal to raise tariffs and cut military spending, it raises some good questions about how we spend our money. Are we getting the most bang for our buck?
Yeah, it makes you think about what's really important, what are we willing to pay for, and how can we achieve our goals without breaking the bank.
Right. And that conversation is valuable, even if we don't end up doing exactly what the video suggests.
And the same goes for Social Security. Agree or disagree with their idea to overhaul the system, it highlights the fact that Social Security is facing some serious problems and we need to find solutions.
Definitely. The current system is facing some real demographic challenges. With the baby boomers retiring and people living longer, we need to be honest about these issues and figure out how to make sure Social Security is there for future generations.
No doubt. This deep dive has really shown how important it is to be informed, to be engaged. We can't just sit back and let other people make these decisions for us.
Absolutely. It's our responsibility to understand what's going on, to weigh the pros and cons, and to speak up for the changes we want to see.
Exactly. Whether it's voting, contacting our elected officials, or even just talking about these issues with friends and family, we all have a role to play in shaping the future of our government and our society.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, that's a wrap for this deep dive. I don't know about you, but I've got a lot to think about. And I'm really curious to hear what our listeners think, what resonated with you, what ideas stood out.
What would you research further? And what are your thoughts on the possibility of change? Do you think we could actually see a major shift in how the government spends and collects money? Or are these radical ideas ultimately just pipe dreams?
Thanks for joining us on this journey through some pretty wild economic ideas. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the topics that matter most.